So when it comes to getting clear sound in your room or in your in-ear monitor mixes or in your recording mix, a ton of what matters is equalization, or EQ for short. I think for most of us when we first start out, EQ is sort of a mystery. I know it was for me. So in this video, I'm going to talk about EQ. I'm going to help you understand some of the common tools that are used in equalization. And once you understand these tools, you'll be able to feel confident using EQ. And as you practice, you'll develop your ear and you'll get better at equalizing sound and you'll get better mixes. And even if you're not a musician or a sound engineer, I'd encourage you to stay with me because I think some of the science is kind of cool. And I think maybe you'll be able to use this knowledge to help make your home stereo or your car stereo sound sick. And I mean sick like in a skateboarding kind of way. Like, that kickflip was sick, not in like a stomach flu kind of way. So stay with me. Well, first we need to talk about Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Munson. So the Fletcher-Munson curve, commonly known today as the equal loudness contour, this graph just helps us understand how humans hear and perceive sound. So here's the thing, sound happens in waves, and low sounds and high sounds are measured in frequencies. The distance from the peak of one wave to the peak of the next is called a wavelength, and frequency is the amount of oscillations of those waves that happen within a given period of time. So here's what I want you to understand. Low sounds, low frequency waves are wider, they have a longer wavelength, and high frequency sounds are shorter and they have shorter wavelengths. So the range of human hearing is from 20 hertz, large wavelengths, down up to 20,000 hertz, short wavelengths. Those are the high-pitched sounds. So Fletcher and Munson did a study where they charted out how humans perceive the loudness of different frequencies. Looking at this equal loudness contour chart, we see that humans are most sensitive to frequencies between 2,000 and 5,000 hertz. And that if you played a 100 hertz tone at 60 decibels, it will be perceived to be the same loudness as 4,000 hertz at about 45 decibels. Also, as we play sounds louder, the chart flattens out a little bit, which means that around 100 decibels, we perceive the frequency spectrum as more even. And maybe that's why we enjoy music when it's a little louder. So anywho, our ears don't perceive every frequency the same way. And microphones, speakers, and even the room you are in will pick up, reproduce, and bounce frequencies around in different ways. You can see frequency responses of different microphones. In fact, here is a chart for the frequency response of the iconic Shure SM58 microphone. When it comes to buying speakers or headphones, you likely want to look for speakers that have a very flat frequency response. There's kind of a saying, flat is where it's at, meaning the speaker will reproduce all of the frequencies fairly evenly. When you're shopping for speakers or headphones, you can look in the specs for the frequency range, and sometimes it will say something like plus or minus 3 dB from this frequency to that frequency. And if they say plus or minus 3 dB, that means that the difference between the frequency that it produces the least well to the one it produces the most well is only 3 decibels difference. A lower quality speaker might say plus or minus 10 dB, and of course the lowest quality of speakers won't even share that information with you because they don't want you to know it. So that's a little bit of the science about what frequencies are, how humans hear sound, and I think this is very helpful. It has been helpful to me as a foundation in mixing sound to just understand how we perceive it. But let's talk now about why we need EQ. Well, we want to make things sound natural, and we can use EQ adjustments to compensate for the frequency response of the microphone, of the speakers, or of the room that you're in, to try to make things sound natural and pleasant. Another reason we use EQ is to separate the instruments in a mix, to give every instrument their own space in the frequency spectrum and help us hear everything clearly. This is where we can sometimes deviate from things sounding completely natural. For example, if you're mixing an acoustic guitar by itself, you might want that guitar to be really broad and take up as much of the frequency spectrum as possible, having lots of low end all the way up to the highs. But if that guitar is in a rock band with drums and a bass guitar, you might take out a little more of the low end of that guitar in order to create some space for the other instruments, and maybe even add a little bit of high-end sparkle, and that will help it cut through the mix a little bit better. But if you soloed that guitar out, it might not sound completely natural. It'd be a little bit on the higher end, but it's just to make room for the other instruments. So there is quite a bit of art and even some subjectivity involved in making EQ choices. So use your ear, train your ear. That's going to be your main guide. Next, I want to take you through some of the different tools that you will encounter as you're working with EQ. Every equalization tool is different. Some have lots of tools and some have very few. But if you know what the tools are, then you can read on the EQ what is available to you. It's actually listed right there. If you don't know this stuff, it just sounds like gibberish. It's just a bunch of numbers and strange words. But I'm going to take you through the tools that you might encounter, and if you know what they are and how they work, then you'll be able to practice them and use them. So first is the term bands. Equalizers come with a different amount of bands. A 3-band EQ will let you adjust frequencies in 3 different areas across the frequency spectrum. A 4-band EQ will let you adjust 4 different places across the frequency spectrum, all the way up to 31-band EQs, which give you 31 options across the frequency spectrum. Some equalizers will let you choose the frequency that the particular band will adjust, and other equalizers are fixed on a certain frequency. So that's another term that you might come across, frequency. If your equalizer has an option labeled frequency, it's usually linked to one of the bands. That means that you can select the frequency that you want to adjust with that band. I happen to have an old an analog mixing board here. Over here, we have a 3-band EQ, high, mid, and a frequency adjustment linked to that mid knob. And then we have a low. The high is fixed at 12,000 hertz, it says. The mid, of course, lets you choose the frequency from 100 hertz up to 8,000 hertz you can choose. And then the low mid is fixed at 80 hertz. But over here, we have a 4-band EQ, and there are no frequency adjustments. So you have a high fixed at 12,000, a high mid fixed at 3,000, a low mid fixed at 500 hertz, and a low fixed at 80 hertz. Another term you'll encounter is gain, and gain is just the increase of amplification of your signal. So when you're adjusting the knob for one of the bands, you're adjusting the gain of that frequency, whether it's fixed on a frequency or whether it's the one that you chose using the frequency knob. Another term you'll come across is called Q. Many digital consoles and DAWs allow you to adjust the Q of each frequency band. So the Q function will widen or narrow the width of the frequencies adjusted in each band. Frequencies are actually adjusted on a bell curve, and so you can widen the Q and affect more frequencies, or you can narrow the Q and affect very few frequencies and be super precise in what you adjust. Similar to Q is the shelf function. Often you'll have an option to shelf the low or the high band of an equalizer. In my experience, a lot of analog mixing boards were defaulted as shelf on the high band and the low band of the equalizer. A shelf is just a different curve than a bell curve. A shelf will affect the frequencies the same past the point to which it is set, as opposed to a bell curve, which will only affect the frequencies inside that curve. The last 2 tools that I'll share with you are high pass and low pass. If your EQ has a high pass option, it will allow you to set the point at which it allows the highs to pass through, and it will drastically decrease the gain of all the frequencies below that point in an extreme way, and usually with a very steep curve. So you won't hear any of the frequencies below that point where you set the high pass. And if a high pass has a Q function, then you can set how steep the adjustment is. High pass can be similar to a shelf on the low band of an EQ, but it's usually more drastic. And a low pass is exactly the same as the high pass, except for it's on the high side of the frequency spectrum. It will allow the low frequencies to pass through unaffected and drastically decrease the gain of every frequency above the point that you've chosen. So your EQ might not have all of these options, but if you know what they are and how they work, then you can just read on your equalizer and you'll know and understand what is available to you. Well, let's talk about how to actually EQ something. So over time, as you practice, you will train and develop your ear, and you'll be able to hear those treble frequencies and go right to those and make the necessary adjustment. But as you're training your ear, one of the best methods I've found is this. It's best to start on the low side of things, so if you have a high pass, bring the high pass up until it sounds natural, and then bring it back down a little bit. This will cut out a lot of the garbage down low in almost any sound source. Exceptions to this are things like the bass drum or bass guitars or instruments that use the low end of the frequency spectrum. These instruments need the bass frequencies, and so while you might use a little bit of high pass, you really want to let these frequencies shine through. And if I were just starting out, I would pretty much just leave the high pass alone on those kinds of instruments. Also, if you're mixing the stereo in your car or like the main output on your sound console for your room, you wouldn't really want to use high pass or low pass because you want to let all the frequencies through. So after you've adjusted the high pass, I'd move to the next band of EQ available to you and boost the gain. For time's sake, and because we have already cut so much of the lows using the high pass, I'll skip the low shelf and just go to the low mid bell curve here. So we'll go to this low mid and we're going to boost the gain of this frequency band. This will let you hear the frequencies that band is affecting in an exaggerated way. Then if you have a frequency option, sweep around through the frequencies until you hear the worst one. When you hear more than one bad frequency, opt for the lowest one. Then lower the gain back to 0, and if you still hear that frequency making your mix sound bad, lower the gain until your mix sounds clear and until it sounds good. You need to be careful not to cut things too far. When you raise the gain, you exaggerated that frequency, and that would make almost anything sound bad. So don't overreact by cutting too much. You may need some of that frequency in the mix, but maybe you just don't need a lot of it. So remember, flat is where it's at. I think if you're using good equipment in a good room, you don't really need to make drastic cuts, but use your ear and do what you have to do to make it sound good. There's another saying, if it sounds good, it is good. Seasoned to taste, like a good chef. Work your way through every band of EQ available to you, making choices to adjust frequencies along the way. It's always best to cut bad frequencies rather than adding in good frequencies. If you try to EQ by boosting the good frequencies, then you're just trying to overcome the bad with the good. And while that might sound like a good plan, it's pretty much commonly accepted that it's better to cut out the bad frequencies than trying to add in good frequencies. There are instances where you may want to boost good frequencies, but let your ear be your guide, and as you're just starting out, I wouldn't worry about that. Just cut the bad frequencies, and as you develop your ear, you'll know when you need to boost something. I also wouldn't worry about Q as a beginner if you have that tool available to you. A lot of the old analog consoles didn't have a Q function, and so you can do quite a bit without it. And again, as you develop your ear, you'll know when you want to make an adjustment to the width of that bell curve. So basically, that's all there is. It takes practice, but now that you know what these tools are and how they work, you should feel free to use them. Try them out, practice with them. I give you permission. You have been deputized. You have a license to EQ. But thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it's been helpful to you. And if you have any comments, tips of your own, questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, have fun mixing sound. I hope that this has been helpful. My channel is about music and adventure. If you like that sort of thing or like this kind of content, go ahead and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.